There we go. Okay. And now we're also on Facebook. Hello, everyone. Welcome to History Matters. And so does a really big cup of coffee. Welcome. Another one, an honorary History Matters mug there. I decided that today would be an anything goes episode because there was just so much to talk about. And I just figured, even while we were waiting for this to officially begin, we were talking about things that would be good to talk about. So this is going to be an even more informal episode than it typically is, but given the fact that this last week felt like it was about 8 weeks, good time to open things up and we could talk about whatever we want to talk about. But before we do that, I turn to my wonderful partner in crime, Annie, who will explain the rules of the game.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Annie Evans from New American History. I'm always delighted to be here with everyone on Friday. It has been a long week for sure. So I am ready to dig into your questions. If you have questions that you'd like to pose, please put those down below in the Q&A because the chat goes way too fast. And we want to make sure that we capture the questions in one place.
Very cool. Okay. And if you are here for your first time, please say so in chat because you will get a very robust welcome from the History Matters community. I've already forgotten. I had that we did our 250th episode. I think this is 252. Is that our 250th?
I'm waiting for 253. Thank you, Carolee.
Okay, so this is a strong community by this point. Like we know each other. But truly, if you're here for the first time, just say so, and you will get quite a welcome from the History Matters community. Okay, so anything goes is pretty much what this episode is going to be. I did want to make a few comments before we open things up. Initially, I thought that perhaps I would talk about executive orders, a history of executive orders, and we can talk a little bit about executive orders simply because we sure are seeing a lot of executive orders. So we could talk about that a little, but there are many other things we can talk about given all of those executive orders and given any number of other things. So maybe I'll even pause there and just let's see where things go. I'll cede control and we can sort of see what we end up speaking about in this episode.
We have our first question popped up.
Excellent.
And it's one of our friends that's been with us for a long time, Deb Pomerantz and Paul Goldman. It says, what can we do about a political system that makes it super hard to make change if people adhere to norm, but way too easy to make change if a president and Congress are determined to ignore those norms?
Well, right. So, and I know I've said before, but I'll mention it here again. One of the fundamental lessons that I've learned sort of viscerally rather than intellectually since Donald Trump's first presidency is the fragility of norms. Intellectually, I could tell you and would have told you before that point, well, they're just norms. So, there are things we agree on and we generally take for granted. And that's just how things operate. But part of the power of norms is that you don't really have to think about them because that's kind of how we generally operate. So during the first Trump presidency, when he began to violate a variety of different norms, and first of all, norms you didn't expect to be violated, and then often nothing happened as a response to violating them. It was a sort of, it drove home the lesson that norms truly are just unspoken agreements of a sort. And in the end, enforcement of something matters, right? I mean, we're in a moment, and it's not the first moment, but it certainly is a moment where you're discovering not just norms, but a variety of other things. Thank you, Lawrence. I said this, I know I said this last week, that whenever I say the word norm, I think of Cheers and I think of norm. So every single time. But we're in this moment where things happen and we think, well, that's just not only is that not the way things are done, but is that actually even constitutional? Can we do that? Will courts allow that? Can this happen? So we've even sort of climbed a rung beyond norms, and we keep asking ourselves over and over again, as do any number of other people, can this happen can this happen? Apparently it is happening. What does that mean? Um, and, there are any number of ways you can talk about the things that supposedly channel government. It's funny. I teach this semester, I'm teaching an undergraduate seminar called The Age of Hamilton and Jefferson. And it's taught entirely after the first 2 weeks, entirely with primary materials, entirely with their letters and their writings. And we were talking about Hamilton actually on Wednesday. And what we ended up talking about, and the word that I kept coming back to because it's very Hamiltonian, is channeling, right? Because Hamilton had a very pessimistic view of human nature. He basically thought that, you have to assume that people are going to do the wrong thing because they just want to, right? You can't count on people to be self-sacrificing. What you need to do is create a strong government that channels selfish passions into pathways that are good, generally speaking, for the community at large. So he's all about channeling things. And in his mind, strong government, channeling passions, that's how you keep things under control. So channeling things, you could say, is a form of control, or at least you would like to think it is one. Checks and balances, right? Another thing that you would think, I mean, we all learn that, I don't know what grade we're in. There are so many teachers here, they will be able to tell us what grade we're in when we supposedly learn about checks and balances. But the idea that our government is grounded on checks and balances, and that the different parts of the government check each other so that one part of the government doesn't have an amazing out of bound amount of power, that there's another form of or part of the government that can check it, that can balance that power. I mean, that's what, in essence, the Constitution and the impulse to create a Constitution, that was about figuring out pathways of power. That's what it was, right? The idea was, who has power? How much power do they have? How is that going to work? It was all about power. And that's what the Constitution is about, is channeling power. So at any rate, that's a very roundabout way of my saying norms are one way in which we channel government power. Obviously, laws are one, and the Constitution is one, and checks and balances are one. There are any number of different ways. And we live in a time where many of them, in a variety of different ways, are being tested. Sometimes I think deliberately tested, right? How far can this go? What can I get away with here? And so in essence, not so much the balancing, but the checks are being tested again and again and again and again. And I don't think anyone has the answer as to where this goes or how this turns out. And I certainly don't have the answer to the original question, which is, what can we do about a government that makes it, easy? Actually, repeat the wording of that question.
It was asking about what do we do about a political system that makes it hard to make change if people adhere to norms, but then we have a president with a Congress that's determined to ignore those norms.
Right. So the norms are the issue. I mean, the fact of the matter is, we do have a system in place that allows us to do things, right? I mean, so sometimes you would think, and you're right, it would be a norm if when someone in government with power wanted to do something, they turned to the system that's already in place for them to do that thing and use that system. And that is not always what is happening right now. So the question is, and we don't have the answer to this question, what happens when norms are just being violated and constitutional restrictions are being tested, and we don't necessarily, or are not thus far necessarily, seeing very much resistance? So we're not seeing a lot of checks, but we're seeing a lot of testing. No one has the answer to what that means, but that is the fundamental question of the moment that we're in, is why is it so easy to violate norms? Why is it so hard to do anything about it? And it really makes you think about the degree to which there were fundamental assumptions that, of course, no one would do X. No one would do this thing. So I don't think a great example of people thinking that there were just basic norms, that would always be basic norms. Think about the fact that during the Constitutional Convention, there was a discussion about the presidency, and there was a debate about whether maybe there should be a council an executive council, not one man with power. The idea being, logically enough, if you give one man power of that sort, he could get carried away. It would be like a king. The United States had just broken away from a king who they considered tyrannical. So how about a council? Wouldn't that be good? You divide up the power, channeling power even more. Well, that was decided to be a bad idea, in part because the assumption was if there are three people and one does something wrong, or they all do something wrong, they could hide behind each other and mask whatever was done wrong, or mask who did the wrong thing, or hide that in one way or another, that would allow misbehavior or corruption in the executive, and that it was far better to have one man be president so that if he did something wrong, he would be ashamed of himself. And that fear of being exposed as being corrupt would hold him in line. That any man who had that much power would be so worried about his reputation and about people thinking that he was corrupt that he would be likely to behave better. That was what they thought during the Constitutional Convention. Okay, so they had this norm that they had this assumption that shame would hold people in check. Okay, that didn't work so well, but that was what they assumed was the case at the time. It's a great example of the fact that was their assumption. Over the history of our government, of our country, there have been any number of other such things that people assumed, well, of course. I mean, if you think about it, on a certain level, if someone said, well, if you're a single executive and you do something really corrupt and everybody knows about it, probably you're going to be less likely to be really corrupt. You could see how some people might think, yeah, actually, we don't live at that time anymore. So I'm going to say it. Those of you who are new here, over our 233 episodes, I don't know.
253.
What did I say?
233. I'm like, don't.
Oh, no, I don't want to trim them. Thank you. 253 episodes. I've said the word contingency 892 million times. And that's partly because to be a historian, you have to be thinking about, is it on the
card? I'm looking, yeah. The print's very small, but it's definitely on the bingo card every week.
Yes, we used to have a bingo card every week. And
a bingo card. This is an old school mug.
An old school mug with a bingo card, and contingency was always on there. I was talking to my graduate seminar this last week, and sure enough, I was talking about contingency. And then whenever I do that, because I speak about it so much here, I end up being far too amused. I'm sure my graduate students were like, why does she think this is so wonderful talking about contingency? But that's the thing, right? Is that if you want to be a good historian, you have to recall that when you're living in the moment, you are living in contingency, meaning you don't necessarily know for sure what's coming down the pike. You're looking forward in time and you're not looking backward in time, but that there are certain moments that are moments of extreme contingency, and we are in one when normal norms can't be taken for granted, when we truly don't know what's going to happen. And it feels as though, and we can certainly come back to this morning, it feels as though there isn't a lot of guidance, or there aren't many places to look for some guidance as to where things might go or can go or should go or can't go. That's where we are right now. So I don't have the solution to that question, but I think it's really important to acknowledge the fact that we're in that kind of moment where everything, constitutional limits, norms, checks, balances, barriers, laws, are being tested. It's just not pleasant to be experiencing that on an ongoing basis. It just isn't. It does not do wonderful things for our nervous systems. But we are in one of those moments. And being aware of that, I'm seeing all these little sad faces come up and the emojis on the side of the screen, which is making me sad. And yet I'm with you. At any rate, what's important is that we are aware of where this all started, the question that all of these things are being violated, that we are aware, given that they're being violated, that we need to watch and we need to call them out when they happen. And we need to talk about what's supposed to happen, what should happen, what isn't supposed to happen. We need to talk about those things. We need to call those things out. I will say, This isn't about what is easy or hard, or, why is it so easy or hard to do something? But the fact of the matter is, calling things out loudly in mass quantities. I say this all the time, and I say it all the time in part because whenever I am on some form of social media and I say, we have to call this out, we have to speak up, there are always people who respond by saying, yeah, right, big deal. What does that do? Like, really, big deal. Like, we can all yell, so what? And my response to that is always, even now, at this moment where things are being tested, to an extreme degree, this government is grounded on public opinion. It was meant from the beginning to be grounded on public opinion more than a monarchy ever was. They talked about public opinion all the time. They didn't quite know who the public was. They disagreed about that. They didn't know how to tell their opinion. There were not sophisticated polling techniques, but they knew that to an extreme degree, public opinion mattered. They tried to figure out how to get public opinion. They sat in taverns listening for public opinion. They looked to see what newspapers people were reading to see public opinion. They stood on courthouse steps to listen to I mean, they were really, by our standards, finding goofy ways to figure out public opinion, but that's because it mattered. And even now, all of these years later, it matters. And it matters in part because that's the way our system runs. But even on a more crass and basic level, if the public is yelling about something and people with power know that, they have an awareness then that the people might turn against them, or that they might lose their job, or that they might lose their support, or that things might not go well for them and their political career on the most basic level. Even on that level, it matters. It really does. And so I will continue to say, I will not ever stop saying, speaking up matters. And, we're still in the midst of what's going to happen with federal funding. But the fact of the matter is that was thrown out and there was a huge response. And then suddenly there was like, well, okay, maybe we'll withdraw. No, we'll withdraw the memo, but we won't withdraw the freeze. Wait, but so there's a lot of tap dancing and backpedaling going on right now. But that's partly a response to the huge outcry, partly from the public, partly from organizations that require federal funding. That's an example, and certainly not the only one in recent times, that when you speak up when something is being violated, when something wrong is happening, that speaking up loudly as a group can have an impact. I will never stop saying this because every time it happens, like this last week, I want to, I'm sure I didn't go back to look and see what my social media accounts look like, but I'm sure I keep saying over and over again, look, right? Speaking up matters. So, no answer to the question, but I'll add on to that question. One thing that we can do is be aware of things being violated, call them out, talk about what should be happening, and protest, push back, yell, talk about it being unfair. Who knows what'll happen, if anything, but we see backpedaling, we see hemming and hawing, right? And that matters because what that does, when we do that, when we speak up, when we're loud, when we say no in mass numbers, we're drawing a line. And people with power might choose to step over that line, but we are in essence saying, no, we don't like it. And that's a message that's pretty damn strong. So drawing that line, saying no, even if we know that people can ignore it, if we don't say that, there's nothing to hold anyone back. If we do say that, now you've got a contest of push and pull. Now you've got people starting out this ongoing process of saying, as we, the people, sorry, we're drawing a line here. We don't like it. And yes, I know that, again, on social media, when I say that sort of thing, people say, well, we have no power. So why does it matter? Game over. No. No. If you think that, maybe your game is over. If we all thought that, then the game would be over. It isn't. It isn't. And I will, again, keep saying this for a very long time. We can push back. We have to push back. Of course, people with power need to push back. We can yell at people with power who are not pushing back hard enough, but we have to be willing to step forward and point out and expose and highlight and protest and voice what is ultimately the majority. I know, Dave, we're still at question one. We are. I got a little off on a rant.
I know. I'm like, oh, the questions are piling up.
No, okay, I'm gonna stop.
So we have a milestone moment, kids. Claire has submitted a question.
Wow.
Claire, who hides behind that little black box in the corner.
Wow.
Learns
Okay.
everything from behind the scenes, but we discovered a function that she can't actually enter questions in the Q&A because she's running the show. So her scribe had to be Cece. So thank you, Cece, for transferring this very good question from Claire. We appreciate it. Claire asks, my friends think this administration is determined to provoke the people to the point of violent protest. Does anybody think that there's any reality to this? In other words, maybe I think what you're saying, Claire, correct me if I'm wrong, like trying to get the Dems to pull a January 6th so that then
martial law.
Right. Good question, Claire.
Right. I mean, I can't say like, yes, that's the plan. I will say that the response to that query should not be, I guess we better not be angry and protest. It is true that generally speaking, there have been people on the right who have been far quicker to be far more violent than many people on the left, right, in recent years. That's just, I'm not being crazy and partisan, and I'm not saying that people on the left are never violent, but generally speaking, that's often, speaking historically, very often when people fear that they don't have the numbers, when they know that basically speaking, they're not the majority, they turn to threats and violence, right? That's my last book, Southerners, fearing they're losing power. And they've always had power over the national government. And maybe now they don't. So they're going to be more and more and more violent to protect their interests. And if you are prone to allow violent solutions to problems. So in other words, if that's part of your repertoire in your toolbox, your political toolbox, like, well, if necessary, we'll just be violent, right? Okay. Then you're going to probably be more likely to think that others are going to do the exact same thing, which I don't necessarily think is the case. So do I think that what's going on now is a deliberate attempt to push Democrats to be violent so that martial law can be called? I don't think, I mean, again, what do I know? I'm sitting here chatting with you from my living room. But generally speaking, I don't think that is the reason. I certainly do think that martial law is in the toolbox in a way that it should not be right now. I think that's worth knowing. I don't think that necessarily means we should shut up and sit down. But it's in the toolkit of things that we don't quite know how they'll be deployed. That could be one thing. But nowhere have I said, in pushing back and speaking up, nowhere have I said, let's be violent at all. And actually, our system is grounded on the fact that civil protest, standing up, speaking out, demonstrating, these are all part of our system. Not only are they allowable, they're part of our system. It's assumed. It's part of why, I realize that nowadays petitions don't mean a heck of a lot, but in earlier times, and particularly late 18th, early 19th centuries, petitions were a big deal. They had real force and real power. And that's why there was all this talk about the right of petition. We have to write a petition. It meant something to sign a piece of paper with a bunch of other people and make a demand or protest in some way. That was a really powerful form of dissent that was built right into the Bill of Rights. So dissent, protest, that's part of what we're supposed to be able to do. And I can't speak about the motives of what's going on right now from perches of power. And I think there's a lot of testing of limits more than anything else going on right now, and seeing what people can get away with and seeing what the response will be, and trying to throw lots of shiny objects around to sort of hide some things and get people to pay attention to others. Does anyone remember like I was going to say a couple of weeks ago, we haven't had a couple of weeks. I don't know how many days ago it was that, and someone correct me if I'm wrong, because it went right by me too. It was like, we're going to open the files of Martin Luther King's assassination and
John Kennedy.
Kennedy's assassination. Hey, look at this. That was like the ultimate shiny object over here thing that to me, I could possibly imagine. It's like, oh, you're worried about things like, oh, I don't know, immigration and ICE and creating deportation camps and all these other things. Hey, Martin Luther King, Kennedy, right? And no one paid any attention to that, as far as I know. We saw no discussion of that. So that to me seemed, and actually I'm not looking at the chat here. That's right, not Epstein, says Kathy. That's true. That felt to me like the ultimate and actually a kind of pathetic attempt at distraction, which in and of itself should be a sign of how some of what we're seeing now it is an attempt to distract, to throw things out that, some things might happen, some things might. Let's make it so that they can't tell the difference. We'll make them worry about every single thing. And hey, by the way, look, and actually, sadly, on the one hand, I was like, good, it didn't work as a distraction. On the other hand, I was like, they threw a little history into the mix. And everyone was like, yeah, whatever, it's history. Back to the present. But at any rate, that to me feels like an obvious and extreme version of a lot of what's going on right now, which is grab a lot, claim a lot, do a lot, point in a lot of directions, throw a lot of spaghetti at the wall, and see what sticks and see what people will allow without speaking up.
Yeah, when you were talking about petitions, I was just wondering because I remember when I was a kid, that was a big deal, right? Like if they stopped serving tater tots in the cafeteria, we're going to get a petition and make the principal bring tater tot, that kind of thing. But they have those online petitions now, change.org. I don't know if you've
Mm-hmm.
heard of them. That's really the only thing that I think younger students or any students really today would know is a digital one. But I'm
Right.
also wondering if the reason polls or not polls, petitions aren't as common as they were in history is maybe like Twitter is our version of, well, not Twitter anymore, but digital social media is the way that we're letting the politicians know. Instead of 500 people signing a petition, we have 500 people directly sending a message to their elected officials every minute practically. So I'm just wondering, like, is social media the new petition?
Well, no, I mean, certainly, I think that's a really interesting idea. And part of the answer to that, I would say, is yes, because of the numbers, right? If you say something on social media and it goes viral, people notice, right? And the thing about that isn't like a petition is that, in a petition, you actually committed your name, and social media is full of anonymous people. And so in a sense, they're not signing their name, although the numbers matter. But that was the thing with petitions. I mean, I remember at some point in my research for my most recent book, there were a bunch of people who submitted a petition. I don't even remember what it was about. It was the dynamics of it that stood out to me. They submitted a petition to Congress, and there were members of Congress who didn't like the petition and attacked it by saying, I don't know who these people are in this petition. I mean, they signed their names, but who are they? They're probably a bunch of, they didn't use this term, but like a bunch of pub crawlers, right? They're a bunch of people hanging out in ale houses. Who are these drunkards? We shouldn't be even listening to them at all. And this was in the congressional record. And because it was in the congressional record, or the equivalent of the congressional record, and at the time, people really kept up with what people were saying in Congress. They read it in the newspaper. The people who signed the petition saw that they were just called, drunkards who don't count and who cares about their petition. So they wrote back to Congress and essentially said, really? Really? We'll tell you who we are. And there actually was an argument between the people who signed the petition and the members of Congress. And that's how known those quantities were, right? Is that there were actual people whose names were on the petition who read and knew what Congress said and responded, and then their names could be checked, right? And people could say, well, I know these people. They're not drunkards hanging out in an alehouse. And as a matter of fact, they're real people. And as a matter of fact, like you can really see how the fact that petitions in that period were not anonymous mattered. Nowadays, I think you're right, Annie. It's like numbers. If you could get big numbers, everything is down to, how many people are going to reply. But still, that there is a power to that. The fact that we know what goes viral and people notice what goes viral, there's a power to that. So yeah, in a way, that is a kind of petition. But yeah, you said Twitter doesn't count, and I saw that someone said But Twitter does count. Yeah, it does. It's just a
No,
very,
it does. It's just a lot of people are leaving Twitter, so
oh,
it's
no, for sure.
not as
But
big as it
it
was.
counts as a very particular kind of petition making body that I'm not in very much anymore.
Yeah. We have so many questions now.
I know, I'm
Uh,
sorry. I'm
no, that's okay. So our wise friend Clinton asks, is it a norm that is easily violated really a norm? He says he would maybe call it a myth that norms and trust are developed over time, not just assumed. So are norms really norms if they are that easy to violate?
I think, I mean, I'm not going to be able to say that sweepingly, yes. I do think that some norms are norms, even if they're easy to violate. And in a sense, that might be a sign of how much of a norm they are, right? When you see how easily they're violated, and you're like, wait, for 150 years, people have done this thing, and now they just decided not to do it, and nothing happened, which would mean that for 150 years, people assumed that that was the norm, right? So I'm probably have told this story before, but when I was actually when I was working on my backstory podcast and chatting with Brian Ballow, I know I miss backstory, chatting with Brian Ballow, who is one of the co-hosts with me, and he was my teacher when I started grad school, so I always saw him as like, senior figure of authority in a sense. And he also did contemporary 20th century political historian, although he also written about the 19th century. And I said, Brian, like it sure seems like they're like norms don't really matter a lot, right? They're just being violated. Like, what is this with norms? And I thought he was going to say some words of wisdom about norms. And he was like, no, really, I understand norms being fragile in a way I never did before. And so part of me thought, yeah, I'm right. And the other part of me thought, oh no, I'm right. Like I shouldn't be right. He's someone who knows more than me. So yeah, I think easily violated does not mean they're not a norm. And in a way, it's almost counterintuitive. If something's been the way we've done things forever and ever and ever, and then suddenly someone decides not to do it and nothing happens, really shows you the degree to which it has been a norm and it wasn't challenged.
I love Brian so much. Um,
Yes,
and I know I've given his book a shout out, but it really is a very interesting book. Not in my backyard. Have you read it yet, Joanne?
I have not read it yet.
So good. It's just so fascinating. Anyway, all right, we have tons more questions. I don't know where to begin. There's so
I
many.
know, and I'm trying to keep up with the chat because
I
that's
know. I've given up trying to keep with the chat. I can't do Q&A and chat at the same time very well. I'm failing at both, I think. Troy, our good buddy Troy asked, aren't the courts going to be the forum in which this entire 4 years gets played out?
repeat that again.
Aren't the courts going to be the forum in which this entire 4 years gets played out?
Well, federal courts, we're going to be thinking about federal courts a lot, really obviously. So this morning when I was, rummaging around trying to decide what I would read in some form of preparation for this, and I was, just reading about the simple fact that federal courts can object to executive orders, right? And that's what we're watching now, so president passes an executive order and then what? So yeah, it is going to be and this has always been the case, right? That's what courts are supposed to be there for challenges and for reckonings of one kind or another, not speaking on a personal criminal level, but on a broader political level. But yeah, I do think that, and particularly right now in this fire hose of executive orders, yeah, it's going to be, among other things, federal courts that say, no, actually, that violates the Constitution. So if nothing else, restraining order. You can't do that. That's going to be hugely important. And that's actually part of why during the Biden administration, when they were focused so hard, and granted, previous Republican administrations did the same thing, but during the Biden administration, one of the things that they focused on, generally speaking, was hiring judges, filling court seats, right? Getting people into the courts. And I think that was always sort of noticed, and it would, there'd be on social media or in the press in some way, hey, more people being appointed to courts. And I think that always got a sort of hey, that's great kind of a response. But you can see how the fact that that was done so often in the past means that there are many people, particularly on the Supreme Court, who think a certain way, and that could be often counted on now, the court to behave a certain way, but that's true more broadly speaking. So yeah, the federal courts are going to be huge. And I don't think that's a surprise, but I think within, the first 2 weeks of this presidency, we can see that that's the case. I mean, executive orders can be murky. There are different kinds of executive orders. What do you do to test an executive order? It's a murky space and thus a useful space if you want to pretend that you can pass laws just because you're president. Executive orders are not supposed to be giving a president the power to do things without involving any other branch of government and just ignoring Congress, right? That's not the way it's supposed to work. But then what? And the courts are going to be part of the answer to that.
Yeah. All right. We have a question from Gloria. Gloria, I don't want to misquote you. I think you meant the word were. I think the question is, were the use of pardons in the Biden administration a violation of norms? There were a couple little tiny typos because I'm a terrible typist too. So I can usually read other people's types, but I think you mean were. If I misquote you, Gloria, please correct me in the chat. And she says have been very partisan. That she said that's right. So were the use of pardons in the Biden administration a violation of norms, meaning that they were partisan?
Well, if we were in a different time period with different circumstances, then that would be a violation of norms. But they were partly in response to an incoming president who had openly declared that part of what he wanted was retribution. And that he was going to seek retribution and go after individuals, people who were on the January 6th committee in Congress, et cetera, et cetera. So were they abnormal? Were they violating norms? In a sense, you could say, yeah, they were. And we could talk about whether that should or shouldn't happen. But part of what you have to factor in is the fact that the pardons were issued because of the weird abnormality of the climate surrounding them. That you have a president coming in and saying, I'm just going to go after the people I don't like who came after me. Right? If that's the circumstance, well, then you're put as the president into a position where you have to decide how far are you going to go to respond to what is an abnormal claim. It is not normal for a president to take office declaring he's going to get revenge against people who he doesn't like. That's not, again, speaking as to how things normally work, a president wants to be the president of all of the American people and recognizes the fact that he and someday she is president of all Americans and doesn't come in assuming that, this is my side of the line and those people are on that side of the line and I don't like them and I'm not going to do things for them and I'm going to treat them as though, they're an other. That's really not the norm for what a president typically means and represents. And like I said, however, time has now condensed into one big blob. But when I spoke about inauguration addresses here on History Matters, I made the point. You have the rancor and the anger and the opposition of a campaign, and then the inaugural address is supposed to be setting things right. And it's supposed to be a president stepping forward and saying, okay, now I'm president and we are going to come back together as a nation and try and do something good together. You might not like me. You might not like what I'm going to do. Okay, I won. That doesn't, at this point, I won. But inaugural addresses are supposed to be we moments. They're supposed to be moments where people realize that now we're a nation and let's try and act like that. Who knows what happens from that point on, but that's the point of them. And that is not what happened, right? So we're talking about a string of violated norms. That becomes a hard thing to parse. So the short answer to Gloria's question is, yeah, in some ways those were violated norms and they were responding to really violated norms. So you know, there were people all over the map. I mean, there were some on the left who objected to them strongly. But in the climate that we're in, that was at least the logic for it.
Yeah. All right. Kathleen V asks, can you discuss the executive order on ending radical indoctrination in K-12 schools? Kevin Levin says, if anyone is pushing for the indoctrination of our students, it is the president.
Hang on a sec here. So I want to say I'm not reading the chat closely because I'm very involved here, but I do want to say, and I've said it before, and Annie, I can see that you said it in chat. This is always, it is always the case that in the Q&A part of History Matters, actually without the Q&A part, chat is feisty, right? People have things to say, and we know each other, generally speaking, and talk to each other. And so not only is it informal, but people kind of know each other. But there are times when it veers off a little bit into anger. And the thing to remember, and in a way, one of the most important things about what we do here is that we're a community. And we're here together doing this. And we don't have to agree. We don't all agree. We can question each other. We can disagree with each other. We can push, what's your evidence for that? Why do you think that? All of these things are part of a normal conversation, but if you're becoming hostile or angry or disruptive or making people angry in a way that you can see that you are making people angry, or you are responding strongly in a way to perhaps what someone didn't mean as anger inducing, just like be careful to check yourself, because we're an us, where are we really, really are. All the years we've been doing this, guys. So in a way, we need to prove to ourselves, and in doing so, in a way, to the world, that you can be a group of people who seriously discuss politics and can do that as a community. That's what we should be dedicated to doing. Okay, I will now shut up because now we have 892 questions.
Yeah, we do. Okay, so Kathleen had asked about the executive order ending radical indoctrination of K-12 schooling. And Kevin Levin, who is very prolific on Substack. I know a lot of people here follow him because they talk about him in Slack, and they've talked about in the chat this morning. Kevin said, if anyone is pushing for the indoctrination of our students, it is the current president. So she was just wondering what you thought about that.
Yeah, I went back and read part of the 1776 report last night because I could see this brewing. And indeed, it's like double speak, where there's indoctrination is going to be attacked through indoctrination. So, the fact that certain things are not allowed to be said, and certain subjects are not allowed to be taught, and certain books are not allowed to be read, and all in the name of not indoctrinating people, that's upside down logic, right? And if you're really basically saying you can only say uplifting, wonderful things about our country, that is indoctrination. It's not, and I would not say as a historian that our country is uniformly always horrible and nothing positive has happened. I teach the founding era, and there were ideas that were made concrete ideologically in that period that came to matter enormously over time for all kinds of marginalized groups, right? There are things that we have done as a nation that are good. There are ways in which, generally speaking, we have improved as a nation. As I tell my students, nothing in American history or any history is a story of this, right? You look at people's rights and it's always this, right? It's better, oh, someone's responding. Oh, better, it's someone, so that's history is call and response. That's how things sort of unfold. But if what you're saying is, don't say negative things about your country, because if you say something negative, you're indoctrinating people. The truth isn't indoctrination. For us to understand who we are as a nation, the good and the bad have to both be there. There is absolutely no way we can understand where we are or how we got here if we are literally not allowed to read books or teach things or learn things that show and focus on mistakes that were made, because mistakes were made, some of them really deliberately, right? We've done bad things as a nation. This is not a controversial statement. And if you're claiming we haven't, that's wacky. I mean, really? You're going to say, like, somehow or other the country is always good and right and better, and we haven't been racist. We don't have racism baked into the system in some way. Sorry, but those are facts. And we can be better than that if we acknowledge there's a problem. So yeah, all of this talk of how there's going to be, an attack on indoctrination is indoctrination. And it's frustrating as heck, right? Because of the reverse logic, because of the upside downness of it, because of how obvious it is. I think about this all the time as a teacher, because I think, what I want my students to do and learn as a teacher is to ask questions and evaluate evidence, right? As a historian, this is what I do. I want them to write, for example, my undergrads write research papers. They find their own topic, they go off into the world of evidence and do research, they construct an argument, I evaluate the merits of the argument. Do they have evidence? Are they proving their point? I don't tell them what to think. I don't tell them what evidence to find. I don't tell them if they're right or wrong unless they're really openly saying something that is, historically untrue. They're learning to evaluate evidence and learning to make arguments and learning to think on their own. That's what school is for. It trained the mind, not indoctrinate with happy little smiley faces so that you can think a certain way always. So it frustrates, I'm sure everyone here must feel the same way. Our job is the opposite of indoctrination, right? Our job is getting students to think and evaluate. And you can see on their faces when they're putting pieces together and figuring things out and like, oh, I never thought of things in that way, in that order. You can see them figure out how their mind works. That's what it's about. So yeah, that's a great example of what we talk about a lot here on History Matters, which that is, if someone says something and it makes you want to clench your teeth and hit a wall, or it makes you want to cry or whatever, pause and consider, maybe that's the point. Or maybe there's something there in this case that, someone calling something yellow when it's red or black when it's white is precisely what they're doing. Unfortunately, and we're here on through the grace of the National Council for History Education, we're going to see a lot of this. We need to actually talk, and Annie, you're involved in this more than I am on an ongoing basis. We need to talk about how to talk about this and how to address this, because it's sure as heck not going to be going away. And so sadly, talking about how we get to actually talk about historical facts and the truth, because there are things that happened, right? We can evaluate and reevaluate and ask different questions, but some things happened, and we need to be able to talk about them and teach about them. And telling people they're not allowed to doesn't make them go away. It just makes us look stupid. Okay, I'll stop.
All right. Ann Mosley, our friend from Illinois, asks, any similarities between the Senate hearings of 1976 and today? I can't help but think of Frank Church and the Church Committee.
I do not have a wise thing to say about that.
Okay. All right, we're going to move on. We've got 13 other questions. And
Yeah,
if you want more context in the chat, that would help folks probably.
And I partly don't have something to say because I saw something in chat I was going to respond to, and now I have lost it. Oh, it was Jacqueline who said, I know it's not related to what we're talking about, but it's so good. If you can add by zombies to a sentence, it's passive voice. That's really good, right? And actually, as much as that just makes me happy, that's worth thinking about, because passive voice is like such a masking maneuver. it was said, it was done, this has been done. You totally can push blame off into nowhere land. So yeah, if you can say it was done by zombies, then yeah, that's passive voice. You need to say so and so did this. And in this particular moment, that's important to remember. So the zombie tool might be handy, not just in classrooms, but on a personal basis.
That's good. All right. Let me see if I can dig through. We've got so many. Okay, so Frida has wanted to know, it says Roe about anti-Semitism attempts to constrain organizations that oppose what's happening in Israel, Gaza, West Bank, which is a dangerous trend. She wanted to know what your thoughts or comments were on that.
That would repeat that because we just veered into a different channel.
She says Roe, I'm wondering if she's made a typo. Anti-Semitism against about anti-Semitism attempts to constrain organizations that oppose what is happening in Israel and Gaza's West Bank. She said it's a dangerous trend and wanted your thoughts on it. I think she's asking what's going on, just your comment in general about what's going on right now with Israel and Gaza West Bank because they had the ceasefire, I guess.
Well, I'm guessing because I mean this I don't know who asked the question, but and I haven't been reading because who can all of the executive orders closely or all of the murmuring closely coming from those in power. But wasn't there discussion over this last week about I don't know, opposing like punishing students who came forward and spoke against Israel or punishing schools that allow students to talk against Israel? What wasn't there
So she clarified it was a typo, executive order. She meant to
oh,
type EO instead of row, and that's why I was
oh.
confused. So the executive order about anti-Semitism, she says that's trying to constrain organizations that oppose what's happening in Israel, Gaza, West Bank, and it's dangerous.
Okay, so I
That makes
mean,
sense.
yeah, and I think if you're going to deport people because they think something you don't like, that's a problem. I also want to say, and I say this as someone who's Jewish, Israel is a country with a government. And what Israel does as a country with a government is not necessarily attributed to or attached to all Jews. So, in other words, if Israel does something heinous, if Israel has a horrible policy, if Israel is killing people, to say that is not anti Semitic. Israel doesn't equal Judaism, it's a country with policies. And that's can be such a murky line that can feel and as I'm certainly someone who is sensitive to anti-Semitism. I've seen a lot of it directed specifically at me over the course of my life from when I was a kid. I mean, like, where was I? I was like in seventh grade when a new kid invited me over to her house to after school and walked me into a room with an older person and then walked me out of the room. And apparently that was her grandmother and said her grandmother had never seen one of me before. Right. So I don't know, looking for horns. I don't know what. But at any rate, I've seen a lot of anti-Semitism. So I'm sensitive to it. I've experienced it. I've thought about it. Saying that the Israeli government is killing people in Gaza, that's not anti-Semitic. That's anti-Israel. And they are not necessarily the same thing. And I'm sure someone's going to jump in my face about this. But I think that's part of the moment we're in, is that some people are taking advantage of the fact that you can say, oh, well, to oppose Israel is anti-Semitic, so we can't do it. That can be a maneuver in addition to a sincere sentiment. So that's worth thinking about. And so I guess that's what I'll say in response to this, because I think the question is right on that line.
All right, we are coming right up on time. We've had a couple people yell mug, mug, mug. So I don't know if we've still got 11 questions. We answered 10. We got about half of them done.
I do want to, Rich says being anti-BB is not being anti-Israel or anti-Semitic. This is important to consider. And anti-Semitism is such, for rightful reasons, is such a triggering concept that it can be easy to deploy in addition to being sincerely and earnestly confronted. So anyway, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Do we want to try and knock a couple more out, or what do you want to do?
Yeah, let's try,
the
we
mug. We want to make sure they see the mug before they have to leave. To you. Okay. So Kathleen has an interesting question, and we've had a little discussion over here in the chat about because Carolee had shared that she uses her family's personal connection to the Japanese incarceration camps in a lesson that she does. So Kathleen was asking, are there parallels between the president sending immigrants to places like Guantanamo Bay and former sites of internment camps where the Japanese Americans were forced to live during World War II? So I didn't realize that's where he was sending them necessarily. I hadn't made that connection. I need to look at that on the map, but she was wondering, is that some kind of symbolic, I think is what she's getting at with that question. Is he doing it on purpose?
I mean, I can't speak to motives. I would say anything that appears to have eerie undertones is probably done deliberately. I mean, part of what's going on right now is, and we've talked about this many times before, right? Part of what's going on right now is making suggestive, threatening sounding noises in the hope that people will shut up and sit down and not protest, right? This is, again, my last book, Southerners in Congress, being threatening, holding weapons, not necessarily using them or always attacking people, but just people were never sure if they would. So threatening noises and threatening gestures kept a lot of Northerners sitting down and shutting up. And that was the intention of those things. That could be really effective. You don't necessarily always have to be violent to have an impact. You can threaten violence. And if you do that in a credible way, then yeah, that actually can have an enormous influence. So some of what we're seeing now, again, there's a lot of testing of things going on. And unfortunately, we, the American citizens, are the test subjects. And that's what it feels like. You know, I think on the one hand, being aware of that is important. On the other hand, it doesn't mean that we can dismiss everything and say, well, it's just a test, because we don't know. You know, right before we came on, maybe, I know there's so many questions, but maybe we can conclude with this, because it was what we were talking about before we began recording, which is how do you survive in this moment where if you tune into the news, there are 892 upsetting things every 5 minutes. And how should we be in this moment? Like, how do we address what's going on in this moment? And I don't necessarily have the answer to that. I was reading about this morning. The mug will come, Dave. Okay, mug, I'll answer this, and then I promise. And it's a new mug. Okay, but before I say that, I know. I do think I find myself deciding what I'm going to be upset about. Not that I'm not upset about everything, but particularly someone that has something of a public platform, I can't speak about everything. And if I speak about everything, no one will listen to anything. So I would say for now, we can talk about, maybe this is next week's topic, is sort of how to process this moment. But anyway, I think it's worth thinking about what you need to do for yourself to keep your sanity. Not doing nice things for yourself is not a bad thing to do in a moment like this. It doesn't mean you're ignoring what's going on. It means you're, you know, taking care of yourself because you need to stay in the fight. Okay, I'm going to shut up because everyone's asking for the mug. So for those of you who are here and are new, every week I have a mug that has something or other to do with what we're talking about. I don't have 253 mugs, but I have a lot of mugs. And sometimes, that's right, marathon, not a sprint. I just saw whiz by. Yes, and yes. At any rate, this week's mug is new. It was a gift mug. And I think it comes from Ellen. Ellen, you gave me this mug recently, right? Well, I need to know just that she gave me this mug like in December, and I haven't used it yet. I'm waiting to see. She'll tell me if she's here. At any rate, I will explain this mug. Okay. You can't see it because I haven't held it up yet. This mug has more to do with what we're going to talk about in the after party than what we're going to talk about now because it's anything goes. And what I realized this morning is anything goes means I could pick any mug. So,
Oh, I love it.
it says chirp. And I'm going to explain what that means in the after party, but I love this. I love this. So, Ellen, this was what you gave me, right?
Yep, she said she did.
Yes.
Beautiful.
And I think she said it made her laugh out loud at the store, and then I opened it and it made me laugh too. And it's a big chirp.
It is a
I'll
big
explain why that mug came along. But before I do, let me explain what's going to happen now. So now we are going to go to the after party. What that means is that we will no longer be recording so that we can be even freer and easier in our conversation than we just were. If you beamed in through the National Council for History Education, just stay right where you are and poof, you will be in the after party. If you are watching us on Facebook, you need to leave Facebook and go to ncheteach.org/conversations. That's ncheteach.org/conversations. And then you too, poof, will be in the after party. Before we poof, I want to thank everyone for being here. I want to thank everyone for being so engaged and having such great questions. And I'm going to ask Claire, as ever, to send me the questions. We can think about who the heck knows what we'll be talking about next week, but maybe it's going to be another week where there'll be like a list of things we need to talk about. I don't know, but I'll collect and look at the questions that are left over. Thank you for engaging in the conversation of democracy on a Friday morning, folks. 253 times. It matters. It matters to us. It's a real community, and it matters that we can do this, that we can prove that you can do this. Not everybody believes that you can do this, that you can have this kind of conversation and earnestly ask questions and be a community. And it's important, maybe now more than ever. So thank you for being here. Okay. I am now going to stop talking and say that for those of you who need to leave right now and are not going to stay for the after party, have a wonderful week. And we will definitely see you next week there'll be a lot to talk about, whatever the heck is going on. Monitor what you're responding to it because it will be my parting words. Be sure to take care of yourself and find some joy in your week too, because that's important.
Absolutely.
Okay.